Reading by Zachary Brewster Geiss, Greenbelt, Maryland, June 2007. The Man Who Was Thursday, A Nightmare, by GK Chesterton. Chapter 13. The Pursuit of the President. Next morning, 5 bewildered but hilarious people took the boat for Dover. The poor old colonel might have had some cause to complain, having been first forced to fight for 2 factions that didn't exist, and then knocked down with an iron lantern. But he was a magnanimous old gentleman, and being much relieved that neither party had anything to do with dynamite, he saw them off on the pier with great geniality. The 5 reconciled detectives had 100 details to explain to each other. The secretary had to tell Syme how they had come to wear masks originally in order to approach the supposed enemy as fellow conspirators. Syme had to explain how they had fled with such swiftness through a civilized country. But above all these matters of detail which could be explained, rose the central mountain of the matter that they could not explain. What did it all mean? If they were all harmless officers, what was Sunday? If he had not seized the world, what on earth had he been up to? Inspector Ratcliffe was still gloomy about this. "I can't make head or tail of old Sunday's little game any more than you can," he said. "But whatever else Sunday is, he isn't a blameless citizen. Damn it, do you remember his face?" "I grant you," answered Syme, "that I have never been able to forget it." "Well," said the secretary, "I suppose we can find out soon, for tomorrow we have our next general meeting." "You will excuse me," he said, with a rather ghastly smile, "for being well acquainted with my secretarial duties." "I suppose you are right," said the professor reflectively. "I suppose we might find it out from him. But I confess that I should feel a bit afraid of asking Sunday who he really is." "Why?" asked the secretary. "For fear of bombs?" "No," said the professor, "for fear he might tell me." "Let us have some drinks," said Dr. Bull, after a silence. Throughout their whole journey by boat and train they were highly convivial, but they instinctively kept together. Dr. Bull, who had always been the optimist of the party, endeavoured to persuade the other 4 that the whole company could take the same hansom cab from Victoria. But this was overruled, and they went in a 4-wheeler with Dr. Bull on the box, singing. They finished their journey at a hotel in Piccadilly Circus, so as to be close to the early breakfast next morning in Leicester Square. Yet even then the adventures of the day were not entirely over. Dr. Bull, discontented with the general proposal to go to bed, had strolled out of the hotel at about 11 to see and taste some of the beauties of London. 20 minutes afterwards he came back and made quite a clamour in the hall. Syme, who tried at first to soothe him, was forced at last to listen to his communication with quite new attention. "I tell you I've seen him," said Dr. Bull with thick emphasis. "Whom?" asked Syme quickly. "Not the President?" "Not so bad as that," said Dr. Bull with unnecessary laughter. "Not so bad as that. I've got him here." "Got whom here?" asked Syme impatiently. "Hairy Man," said the other lucidly. "Man that used to be Hairy Man. Gogol. Here he is." And he pulled forward by a reluctant elbow the identical young man who 5 days before had marched out of the council with thin red hair and a pale face, the first of all the sham anarchists who had been exposed. "Why do you worry with me?" he cried. "You have expelled me as a spy." "We are all spies," whispered Syme. "We're all spies!" shouted Dr. Bull. "Come and have a drink!" Next morning, the battalion of the reunited 6 marched stolidly towards the hotel in Leicester Square. "This is more cheerful," said Dr. Bull. "We are 6 men going to ask 1 man what he means." "I think it is a bit queerer than that," said Syme. "I think it is 6 men going to ask 1 man what they mean." They turned in silence into the square, and though the hotel was in the opposite corner, they saw at once the little balcony and a figure that looked too big for it. He was sitting alone with bent head, poring over a newspaper. But all his councillors, who had come to vote him down, crossed that square as if they were watched out of heaven by 100 eyes. They had disputed much upon their policy, about whether they should leave the unmasked Gogol without and begin diplomatically, or whether they should bring him in and blow up the gunpowder at once. The influence of Syme and Bull prevailed for the latter course, though the secretary to the last asked them why they attacked Sunday so rashly. "My reason is quite simple," said Syme. "I attack him rashly because I am afraid of him." They followed Syme up the dark stair in silence. and they all came out simultaneously into the broad sunlight of the morning and the broad sunlight of Sunday's smile. "Delightful," he said. "So pleased to see you all. What an exquisite day it is. Is the Tsar dead?" The secretary, who happened to be foremost, drew himself together for a dignified outburst. "No, sir," he said sternly. "There has been no massacre. I bring you news of no such disgusting spectacles." "Disgusting spectacles?" repeated the president with a bright, inquiring smile. "You mean Dr. Bull's spectacles?" The secretary choked for a moment, and the president went on with a sort of smooth appeal. "Of course, we all have our opinions and even our eyes, but really to call them disgusting, before the man himself." Dr. Bull tore off his spectacles and broke them on the table. "My spectacles are blackguardly," he said, "but I'm not. Look at my face." "I dare say it's the sort of face that grows on one," said the president. "In fact, it grows on you. And who am I to quarrel with the wild fruits upon the tree of life? I dare say it will grow on me some day." "We have no time for tomfoolery," said the secretary, breaking in savagely. "We have come to know what all this means. Who are you? What are you? Why did you get us all here? Do you know who and what we are? Are you a half-witted man playing the conspirator, or are you a clever man playing the fool? Answer me, I tell you!" "Candidates," murmured Sunday, "are only required to answer 8 out of the 17 questions on the paper. As far as I can make out, you want me to tell you what I am and what you are and what this table is and what the council is and what this world is for all I know. Well, I will go so far as to rend the veil of one mystery. If you want to know what you are a set of highly well-intentioned young jackasses." "And you," said Syme, leaning forward, "what are you?" "I? What am I?" roared the president, and he rose slowly to an incredible height, like some enormous wave about to arch above them and break. "You want to know what I am, do you? Bull, you are a man of science. Grub in the roots of those trees and find out the truth about them. Syme, you are a poet. Stare at those morning clouds. But I tell you this, that you will have found out the truth of the last tree and the topmost clouds before the truth about me. You will understand the sea, and I shall still be a riddle. You shall know what the stars are and not know what I am. Since the beginning of the world, all men have hunted me like a wolf. Kings and sages, and poets and lawgivers, all the churches, and all the philosophies. But I have never been caught yet, and the skies will fall in the time I turn to bay. I have given them a good run for their money, and I will now." Before one of them could move, the monstrous man had swung himself like some huge orangutan over the balustrade of the balcony. Yet before he dropped, he pulled himself up again as on a horizontal bar, and thrusting his great chin over the edge of the balcony, said solemnly, "There's one thing I'll tell you, though, about who I am. I am the man in the dark room who made you all policemen." With that, he fell from the balcony, bouncing on the stones below like a great ball of India rubber, and went bounding off towards the corner of the Alhambra, where he hailed a hansom cab and sprang inside it. The 6 detectives had been standing thunderstruck and livid in the light of his last assertion, but when he disappeared into the cab, Syme's practical senses returned to him, and leaping over the balcony so recklessly as almost to break his legs, he called another cab. He and Bull sprang into the cab together, the professor and the inspector into another, while the secretary and the late Gogol scrambled into a third just in time to pursue the flying Syme, who was pursuing the flying president. Sunday led them a wild chase towards the northwest, his cabman, evidently under the influence of more than common inducements, urging the horse at breakneck speed. But Syme was in no mood for delicacies, and he stood up in his own cab shouting, "Stop, thief!" until crowds ran along beside his cab, and policemen began to stop and ask questions. All this had its influence upon the president's cabman, who began to look dubious and to slow down to a trot. He opened the trap to talk reasonably to his fare, and in so doing let the long whip droop over the front of the cab. Sunday leant forward, seized it, and jerked it violently out of the man's hand. Then, standing up in front of the cab himself, he lashed the horse and roared aloud so that they went down the streets like a flying storm. Through street after street and square after square went whirling this preposterous vehicle, in which the fare was urging the horse, and the driver trying desperately to stop it. The other 3 cabs came after it, if the phrase be permissible of a cab, like panting hounds. Shops and streets shot by like rattling arrows. At the highest ecstasy of speed, Sunday turned round on the splashboard where he stood, and sticking his great grinning head out of the cab, with white hair whistling in the wind, he made a horrible face at his pursuers, like some colossal urchin. Then raising his right hand swiftly, he flung a ball of paper in Syme's face and vanished. Syme caught the thing while instinctively warding it off, and discovered that it consisted of 2 crumpled papers. One was addressed to himself, and the other to Dr. Bull, with a very long, and it is to be feared partly ironical, string of letters after his name. Dr. Bull's address was, at any rate, considerably longer than his communication, for the communication consisted entirely of the words, "What about Martin Tupper now?" "What does the old maniac mean?" asked Bull, staring at the words. "What does yours say, Syme?" Syme's message was, at any rate, longer, and ran as follows. "No one would regret anything in the nature of an interference by the Archdeacon more than I. I trust it will not come to that. But for the last time, where are your galoshes? The thing is too bad, especially after what Uncle said." The President's cabman seemed to be regaining some control over his horse, and the pursuers gained a little as they swept round into the Edgware Road. And here there occurred what seemed to the Allies a providential stoppage. Traffic of every kind was swerving to right or left or stopping, for down the long road was coming the unmistakable roar announcing the fire engine, which in a few seconds went by like a brazen thunderbolt. But quick as it went by, Sunday had bounded out of his cab, sprung at the fire engine, caught it, slung himself onto it, and was seen as he disappeared in the noisy distance talking to the astonished fireman with explanatory gestures. "After him!" howled Syme. "He can't go astray now. There's no mistaking a fire engine." The 3 cabmen, who had been stunned for a moment, whipped up their horses and slightly decreased the distance between themselves and their disappearing prey. The President acknowledged this proximity by coming to the back of the car, bowing repeatedly, kissing his hand, and finally flinging a neatly folded note into the bosom of Inspector Ratcliffe. When that gentleman opened it, not without impatience, he found it contained the words, "Fly at once. The truth about your trouser stretchers is known. A friend." The fire engine had struck still farther to the north, into a region that they did not recognize. And as it ran by a line of high railings shadowed with trees, the 6 friends were startled, but somewhat relieved, to see the President leap from the fire engine, though whether through another whim or the increasing protest of his entertainers, they could not see. Before the 3 cabs, however, could reach up to the spot, he had gone up the high railings like a huge grey cat, tossed himself over, and vanished in a darkness of leaves. Syme, with a furious gesture, stopped his cab, jumped out, and sprang also to the escalade. When he had one leg over the fence, and his friends were following, he turned a face on them which shone quite pale in the shadow. "What place can this be?" he asked. "Can it be the old devil's house? I've heard he has a house in North London." "All the better," said the secretary grimly, planting a foot in a foothold. "We shall find him at home." "No, but it isn't that," said Syme, knitting his brows. "I hear the most horrible noises, like devils laughing and sneezing and blowing their devilish noses." "His dog's barking, of course," said the secretary. "Why not say his blackbeetle's barking?" said Syme furiously. "Snails barking! Geraniums barking! Did you ever hear a dog bark like that?" He held up his hand, and there came out of the thicket a long growling roar that seemed to get under the skin and freeze the flesh, a low thrilling roar that made a throbbing in the air all about them. "The dogs of Sunday would be no ordinary dogs," said Gogol, and shuddered. Syme had jumped down on the other side, but he still stood listening impatiently. "Well, listen to that," he said. "Is that a dog? Anybody's dog?" There broke upon their ear a hoarse screaming as of things protesting and clamouring in sudden pain, and then far off like an echo what sounded like a long nasal trumpet. "Well, his house ought to be hell," said the secretary. "And if it is hell, I'm going in." And he sprang over the tall railings almost with one swing. The others followed. They broke through a tangle of plants and shrubs and came out on an open path. Nothing was in sight, but Dr. Bull suddenly struck his hands together. "Why, you asses!" he cried. "It's the zoo!" As they were looking round wildly for any trace of their wild quarry, a keeper in uniform came running along the path with a man in plain clothes. "Has it come this way?" gasped the keeper. "Has what?" asked Syme. "The elephant!" cried the keeper. "An elephant has gone mad and run away." "He has run away with an old gentleman," said the other stranger breathlessly. "A poor old gentleman with white hair." "What sort of old gentleman?" asked Syme with great curiosity. "A very large and fat old gentleman in light grey clothes," said the keeper eagerly. "Well," said Syme, "if he's that particular kind of old gentleman, if you're quite sure that he's a large and fat old gentleman in grey clothes, you may take my word for it that the elephant has not run away with him. He has run away with the elephant. The elephant is not made by God that could run away with him if he did not consent to the elopement, and by thunder, there he is!" There was no doubt about it this time. Clean across the space of grass, about 200 yards away, with a crowd screaming and scampering vainly at his heels, went a huge grey elephant at an awful stride, with his trunk thrown out as rigid as a ship's bowsprit and trumpeting like the trumpet of doom. On the back of the bellowing and plunging animal sat President Sunday, with all the placidity of a sultan, but goading the animal to a furious speed with some sharp object in his hand. "Stop him!" screamed the populace. "He'll be out of the gate!" "Stop a landslide!" said the keeper. "He is out of the gate!" And even as he spoke, a final crash and roar of terror announced that the great grey elephant had broken out of the gates of the zoological gardens and was careening down Albany Street like a new and swift sort of omnibus. "Great Lord!" cried Bull. "I never knew an elephant could go so fast. Well, it must be hansom cabs again if we are to keep him in sight." As they raced along to the gate out of which the elephant had vanished, Syme felt a glaring panorama of the strange animals in the cages which they passed. Afterwards he thought it queer that he should have seen them so clearly. He remembered especially seeing pelicans with their preposterous pendant throats. He wondered why the pelican was the symbol of charity, except it was that it wanted a good deal of charity to admire a pelican. He remembered a hornbill, which was simply a huge yellow beak with a small bird tied on behind it. The whole gave him a sensation, the vividness of which he could not explain, that nature was always making quite mysterious jokes. Sunday had told him that they would understand him when they had understood the stars. He wondered whether even the archangels understood the hornbill. The 6 unhappy detectives flung themselves into cabs and followed the elephant, sharing the terror which he spread through the long stretch of the streets. This time Sunday did not turn round, but offered them the solid stretch of his unconscious back, which maddened them, if possible, more than his previous mockeries. Just before they came to Baker Street, however, he was seen to throw something far up into the air, as a boy does a ball meaning to catch it again. But at their rate of racing it fell far behind, just by the cab containing Gogol, and in faint hope of a clue or for some impulse unexplainable, he stopped his cab so as to pick it up. It was addressed to himself and was quite a bulky parcel. On examination, however, its bulk was found to consist of 33 pieces of paper of no value wrapped one round the other. When the last covering was torn away, it reduced itself to a small slip of paper on which was written, "The word, I fancy, should be pink." The man once known as Gogol said nothing, but the movements of his hands and feet were like those of a man urging a horse to renewed efforts. Through street after street, through district after district, went the prodigy of the flying elephant, calling crowds to every window and driving the traffic left and right. And still through all this insane publicity the 3 cabs toiled after it until they came to be regarded as part of a procession, and perhaps the advertisement of a circus. They went at such a rate that distances were shortened beyond belief, and Syme saw the Albert Hall in Kensington when he thought that he was still in Paddington. The animal's place was even more fast and free through the empty, aristocratic streets of South Kensington, and he finally headed towards that part of the skyline where the enormous wheel of Earl's Court stood up in the sky. The wheel grew larger and larger till it filled heaven like the wheel of stars. The beast outstripped the cabs. They lost him round several corners, and when they came to one of the gates of the Earl's Court exhibition, they found themselves finally blocked. In front of them was an enormous crowd. In the midst of it was an enormous elephant, heaving and shuddering, as such shapeless creatures do. But the president had disappeared. "Where has he gone to?" asked Syme, slipping to the ground. "Gentlemen rushed into the exhibition, sir," said an official in a dazed manner. Then he added in an injured voice, "Funny gentleman, sir. Asked me to hold his horse and gave me this." He held out with distaste a piece of folded paper addressed to the Secretary of the Central Anarchist Council. The secretary, raging, rent it open and found written inside it, "When the herring runs a mile, let the secretary smile. When the herring tries to fly, let the secretary die." Rustic proverb. "Why, the eternal crikey," began the secretary. "Did you let the man in? Do people commonly come to your exhibition riding on mad elephants? Do—" "Look!" shouted Syme suddenly. "Look over there!" "Look at what?" asked the secretary savagely. "Look at the captive balloon! said Syme, and pointed in a frenzy.
"Why the blazes should I look at a captive balloon?" demanded the secretary. "What is there queer about a captive balloon?"
Nothing, said Syme, except that it isn't captive. They all turned their eyes to where the balloon swung and swelled above the exhibition on a string, like a child's balloon. A second afterwards, the string came into just under the car, and the balloon, broken loose, floated away with the freedom of a soap bubble.
10,000 devils! Shrieked the secretary. "He's got into it!"
And he shook his fists at the sky. The balloon, borne by some chance wind, came right above them, and they could see the great white head of the president peering over the side and looking benevolently down on them.
"God bless my soul,"
said the professor, with the elderly manner that he could never disconnect from his bleached beard and parchment face.
"God bless my soul, I seem to fancy that something fell on the top of my hat."
He put up a trembling hand and took from that shelf a piece of twisted paper, which he opened absently, only to find it inscribed with a true lover's knot and the words, "Your beauty has not left me indifferent, from little Snowdrop." There was a short silence, and then Syme said, biting his beard, "I'm not beaten yet. The blasted thing must come down somewhere. Let's follow it." Chapter 14. The Six Philosophers. Across green fields and breaking through blooming hedges toiled 6 draggled detectives about 5 miles out of London. The optimist of the party had at first proposed that they should follow the balloon across South England in hansom cabs, but he was ultimately convinced of the persistent refusal of the balloon to follow the roads, and the still more persistent refusal of the cabmen to follow the balloon. Consequently, the tireless, though exasperated travellers broke through black thickets and ploughed through ploughed fields till each was turned into a figure too outrageous to be mistaken for a tramp. Those green hills of Surrey saw the final collapse and tragedy of the admirable light grey suit in which Syme had set out from Saffron Park. His silk hat was broken over his nose by a swinging bough, his coat-tails were torn to the shoulder by arresting thorns, the clay of England was splashed up to his collar, but he still carried his yellow beard forward with a silent and furious determination, and his eyes were still fixed on that floating ball of gas, which in the full flush of sunset seemed coloured like a sunset cloud. "After all," he said, "it is very beautiful."
"It is singularly and strangely beautiful," said the professor. "I wish the beastly gas bag would burst." "No," said Dr. Bull, "I hope it won't. It might hurt the old boy." "Hurt him?" said the vindictive professor. "Hurt him? Not as much as I'd hurt him if I could get up with him, little Snowdrop." "I don't want him hurt somehow," said Dr. Bull. "What?" cried the secretary bitterly. "Do you believe all that tale about his being our man in the dark room? Sunday would say he was anybody." "I don't know whether I believe it or not," said Dr. Bull. "But it isn't that I mean. I can't wish old Sunday's balloon to burst because—" "Well," said Syme impatiently, "because?" "Well, because he's so jolly like a balloon himself," said Dr. Bull desperately. "I don't understand a word of all that idea of his being the same man who gave us all our blue cards. It seems to make everything nonsense. But I don't care who knows it. I always had a sympathy for old Sunday himself, wicked as he was, just as if he was a great bouncing baby. How can I explain what my queer sympathy was? It didn't prevent my fighting him like hell. Shall I make it clear if I say that I liked him because he was so fat?" "You will not," said the secretary. "I've got it now. It was because he was so fat and so light, just like a balloon. We always think of fat people as heavy, but he could have danced against a sylph. I see now what I mean. Moderate strength is shown in violence. Supreme strength is shown in levity. It was like the old speculations. What would happen if an elephant could leap up in the sky like a grasshopper?" "Our elephant," said Syme, looking upwards, "has leapt into the sky like a grasshopper." "And somehow," concluded Bull, "that's why I can't help liking old Sunday. No, it's not an admiration of force or any silly thing like that. There is a kind of gaiety in the thing, as if he were bursting with some good news. Haven't you sometimes felt it on a spring day? You know nature plays tricks, but somehow that day proves they are good-natured tricks. I have never read the Bible myself, but that part they laugh at is literal truth. Why leap ye high hills? The hills do leap, at least they try to." Why do I like Sunday? How can I tell you? Because he's such a bounder.
There was a long silence, and then the secretary said in a curious, strained voice,
You do not know Sunday at all. Perhaps it is because you are better than I, and do not know hell. I was a fierce fellow, and a trifle morbid from the first. The man who sits in darkness, and who chose us all, chose me because I had all the crazy look of a conspirator, because my smile went crooked, and my eyes were gloomy even when I smiled. But there must have been something in me that answered to the nerves in all these anarchic men, for when I first saw Sunday, he expressed to me not your airy vitality, but something both gross and sad in the nature of things. I found him smoking in a twilight room, a room with brown blind down, infinitely more depressing than the genial darkness in which our master lives. He sat there on a bench, a huge heap of a man, dark and out of shape. He listened to all my words without speaking or even stirring. I poured out my most passionate appeals and asked my most eloquent questions. Then after a long silence, the thing began to shake, and I thought it was shaken by some secret malady. It shook like a loathsome and living jelly. It reminded me of everything I had ever read about the base bodies that are the origin of life, the deep sea lumps and protoplasm. It seemed like the final form of matter, the most shapeless and the most shameful. I could only tell myself from its shudderings that it was something at least that such a monster could be miserable. And then it broke upon me that the bestial mountain was shaking with a lonely laughter, and the laughter was at me. Do you ask me to forgive him that? It is no small thing to be laughed at by something at once lower and stronger than oneself.
Surely you fellows are exaggerating wildly, cut in the clear voice of Inspector Ratcliffe. President Sunday is a terrible fellow for one's intellect, but he's not such a Barnum's freak physically as you make out. He received me in an ordinary office, in a grey check coat, in broad daylight. He talked to me in an ordinary way. But I'll tell you what is a trifle creepy about Sunday. His room is neat, his clothes are neat, everything seems in order, but he's absent-minded. Sometimes his great bright eyes go quite blind. For hours, he forgets that you are there. Now, absent-mindedness is a bit too awful in a bad man. We think of a wicked man as vigilant. We can't think of a wicked man who is honestly and sincerely dreamy because we daren't think of a wicked man alone with himself. An absent-minded man means a good-natured man. It means a man who, if he happens to see you, will apologize. But how will you bear an absent-minded man who, if he happens to see you, will kill you? That is what tries the nerves, abstraction combined with cruelty. Men have felt it sometimes when they went through wild forests, and felt that the animals there were at once innocent and pitiless. They might ignore or slay. How would you like to pass 10 mortal hours in a parlor with an absent-minded tiger?
And what do you think of Sunday, Gogol? Asked Syme. I don't think of Sunday on principle, said Gogol simply, any more than I stare at the sun at noonday.
Well, that is a point of view, said Syme thoughtfully. What do you say, Professor? The Professor was walking with bent head and trailing stick, and he did not answer at all. Wake up, Professor, said Syme genially. Tell us what you think of Sunday. The Professor spoke at last very slowly.
I think something, he said, that I cannot say clearly. Or rather, I think something that I cannot even think clearly. But it is something like this. My early life, as you know, was a bit too large and loose. Well, when I saw Sunday's face, I thought it was too large. Everybody does. But I also thought it was too loose. The face was so big that one couldn't focus it or make it a face at all. The eye was so far away from the nose that it wasn't an eye. The mouth was so much by itself that one had to think of it by itself. The whole thing is too hard to explain.
He paused for a little, still trailing his stick, and then went on.
But put it this way. Walking up a road at night, I have seen a lamp and a lighted window and a cloud make together a most complete and unmistakable face. If anyone in heaven has that face, I shall know him again. Yet when I walked a little farther, I found that there was no face, that the window was 10 yards away, the lamp 1,000 yards, the cloud beyond the world. Well, Sunday's face escaped me. It ran away to right and left, as such chance pictures run away. And so his face has made me somehow doubt whether there are any faces. I don't know whether your face, Bull, is a face or a combination in perspective. Perhaps one black disc of your beastly glasses is quite close and another 50 miles away. Oh, the doubts of a materialist are not worth a dump. Sunday has taught me the last and the worst doubts, the doubts of a spiritualist. I am a Buddhist, I suppose, and Buddhism is not a creed, it is a doubt. My poor dear Bull, I do not believe that you really have a face. I have not faith enough to believe in matter.
Syme's eyes were still fixed upon the errant orb, which, reddened in the evening light, looked like some rosier and more innocent world. "Have you noticed an odd thing," he said, "about all your descriptions? Each man of you finds Sunday quite different, yet each man of you can only find one thing to compare him to, the universe itself. Bull finds him like the earth in spring, Gogol like the sun at noonday, the secretary is reminded of the shapeless protoplasm, and the inspector of the carelessness of virgin forests. The professor says he is like a changing landscape. This is queer, but it is queerer still that I also have had my odd notion about the president, and I also find that I think of Sunday as I think of the whole world." "Get on a little faster, Syme," said Bull. "Never mind the balloon." "When I first saw Sunday," said Syme slowly, "I only saw his back. And when I saw his back, I knew he was the worst man in the world. His neck and shoulders were brutal like those of some apish god. His head had a stoop that was hardly human, like the stoop of an ox. In fact, I had at once the revolting fancy that this was not a man at all, but a beast dressed up in men's clothes." "Get on," said Dr. Bull. "And then the queer thing happened. I had seen his back from the street as he sat in the balcony. Then I entered the hotel, and coming round the other side of him, saw his face in the sunlight. His face frightened me, as it did everyone, but not because it was brutal, not because it was evil. On the contrary, it frightened me because it was so beautiful, because it was so good."
"Syme," exclaimed the secretary, "are you ill?"
It was like the face of some ancient archangel judging justly after heroic wars. There was laughter in the eyes, and in the mouth honor and sorrow. There was the same white hair, the same great grey-clad shoulders that I had seen from behind. But when I saw him from behind, I was certain he was an animal. And when I saw him in front, I knew he was a god.
"Pan," said the professor dreamily, "was a god and an animal."
Then and again and always, went on Syme like a man talking to himself, that has been for me the mystery of Sunday, and it is also the mystery of the world. When I see the horrible back, I am sure the noble face is but a mask. When I see the face but for an instant, I know the back is only a jest. Bad is so bad that we cannot but think good an accident. Good is so good that we feel certain that evil could be explained. But the whole came to a kind of crest yesterday when I raced Sunday for the cab and was just behind him all the way."
"Had you time for thinking, then?" asked Ratcliffe.
"Time," replied Syme, "for one outrageous thought. I was suddenly possessed with the idea that the blind, blank back of his head really was his face, an awful, eyeless face staring at me. And I fancied that the figure running in front of me was really a figure running backwards and dancing as he ran." "Horrible," said Dr. Bull, and shuddered. "Horrible is not the word," said Syme. "It was exactly the worst instant of my life. And yet 10 minutes afterwards, when he put his head out of the cab and made a grimace like a gargoyle, I knew that he was only like a father playing hide-and-seek with his children." "It is a long game," said the secretary, and frowned at his broken boots. "Listen to me," cried Syme with extraordinary emphasis. "Shall I tell you the secret of the whole world? It is that we have only known the back of the world. We see everything from behind, and it looks brutal. That is not a tree, but the back of a tree. That is not a cloud, but the back of a cloud. Can you not see that everything is stooping and hiding a face? If we could only get round in front—" "Look!" cried out Bull clamorously.
The balloon is coming down!"
There was no need to cry out to Syme, who had never taken his eyes off it. He saw the great luminous globe suddenly stagger in the sky, right itself, and then sink slowly behind the trees like a setting sun. The man called Gogol, who had hardly spoken through all their weary travels, suddenly threw up his hands like a lost spirit. "He is dead!" he cried. "And now I know he was my friend in the dark!"
"Dead," snorted the secretary. "You will not find him dead easily. If he has been tipped out of the car, we shall find him rolling as a colt rolls in a field, kicking his legs for fun." "Clashing his hoofs," said the professor. "The colts do, and so did Pan." "Pan again," said Dr. Bull irritably. "You seem to think Pan is everything." "So he is," said the professor. "In Greek, he means everything." "Don't forget," said the secretary, looking down, "that he also means panic."
Syme had stood without hearing any of the exclamations. "It fell over there," he said shortly. "Let us follow it." Then he added, with an indescribable gesture, "Oh, if he has cheated us all by getting killed, it would be like one of his larks." He strode off towards the distant trees with a new energy, his rags and ribbons fluttering in the wind. The others followed him in a more footsore and dubious manner, and almost at the same moment all 6 men realized that they were not alone in the little field. Across the square of turf, a tall man was advancing towards them, leaning on a strange long staff like a scepter. He was clad in a fine but old-fashioned suit with knee breeches. Its color was that shade between blue, violet, and gray which can be seen in certain shadows of the woodland. His hair was whitish gray, and at the first glance, taken along with his knee breeches, looked as if it was powdered. His advance was very quiet, but for the silver frost upon his head, he might have been one to the shadows of the wood. "Gentlemen," he said, "my master has a carriage waiting for you in the road just by." "Who is your master?" asked Syme, standing quite still. "I was told you knew his name," said the man respectfully. There was a silence, and then the secretary said, "Where is this carriage?" "It has been waiting only a few moments," said the stranger. "My master has only just come home." Syme looked left and right upon the patch of green field in which he found himself. The hedges were ordinary hedges, the trees seemed ordinary trees, yet he felt like a man entrapped in fairyland. He looked the mysterious ambassador up and down, but he could discover nothing except that the man's coat was the exact color of the purple shadows, and that the man's face was the exact color of the red and brown and golden sky. "Show us the place," Syme said briefly, and without a word the man in the violet coat turned his back and walked towards a gap in the hedge, which let in suddenly the light of a white road. As the 6 wanderers broke out upon the thoroughfare, they saw the white road blocked by what looked like a long row of carriages, such a row of carriages as might close the approach to some house in Park Lane. Along the side of these carriages stood a rank of splendid servants, all dressed in the grey-blue uniform, and all having a certain quality of stateliness and freedom, which would not commonly belong to the servants of a gentleman, but rather to the officials and ambassadors of a great king. There were no less than 6 carriages waiting, one for each of the tattered and miserable band. All the attendants, as if in court dress, wore swords, and as each man crawled into his carriage they drew them and saluted with a sudden blaze of steel. "What can it all mean?" asked Bull of Syme as they separated. "Is this another joke of Sundays?" "I don't know," said Syme as he sank wearily back in the cushions of his carriage. "But if it is, it's one of the jokes you talk about. It's a good-natured one." The 6 adventurers had passed through many adventures, but not one had carried them so utterly off their feet as this last adventure of comfort. They had all become inured to things going roughly, but things suddenly going smoothly swamped them. They could not even feebly imagine what the carriages were. It was enough for them to know that they were carriages, and carriages with cushions. They could not conceive who the old man was who had led them, but it was quite enough that he had certainly led them to the carriages. Syme drove through a drifting darkness of trees in utter abandonment. It was typical of him that while he had carried his bearded chin forward fiercely so long as anything could be done, when the whole business was taken out of his hands, he fell back on the cushions in a frank collapse. Very gradually and very vaguely he realized into what rich roads the carriage was carrying him. He saw that they passed the stone gates of what might have been a park, that they began gradually to climb a hill which, while wooded on both sides, was somewhat more orderly than a forest. Then there began to grow upon him, as upon a man slowly waking from a healthy sleep, a pleasure in everything. He felt that the hedges were what hedges should be, living walls, that a hedge is like a human army, disciplined, but all the more alive. He saw high elms behind the hedges, and vaguely thought how happy boys would be climbing there. Then his carriage took a turn of the path, and he saw subtly and quietly, like a long, low sunset cloud, a long, low house, mellow in the mild light of sunset. All the 6 friends compared notes afterwards and quarreled, but they all agreed that in some unaccountable way the place reminded them of their boyhood. It was either this elm top or that crooked path, it was either this scrap of orchard or that shape of a window, but each man of them declared that he could remember this place before he could remember his mother. When the carriages eventually rolled up to a large, low, cavernous gateway, another man in the same uniform, but wearing a silver star on the grey breast of his coat, came out to meet them. This impressive person said to the bewildered Syme, "Refreshments are provided for you in your room." Syme, under the influence of the same mesmeric sleep of amazement, went up the large oaken stairs after the respectful attendant. He entered a splendid suite of apartments that seemed to be designed specially for him. He walked up to a long mirror with the ordinary instinct of his class, to pull his tie straight or to smooth his hair. And there he saw the frightful figure that he was, blood running down his face from where the bough had struck him, his hair standing out like yellow rags of rank grass, his clothes torn into long wavering tatters. At once the whole enigma sprang up, simply as the question of how he had got there, and how he was to get out again. Exactly at the same moment, a man in blue, who had been appointed as his valet, said very solemnly, "I've put out your clothes, sir." "Clothes?" said Syme sardonically. "I have no clothes except these." And he lifted 2 long strips of his frock coat in fascinating festoons, and made a movement as if to twirl, like a ballet girl. "My master asks me to say," said the attendant, "that there is a fancy dress ball tonight, and that he desires you to put on the costume that I have laid out. Meanwhile, sir, there is a bottle of Burgundy and some cold pheasant, which he hopes you will not refuse, as it is some hours before supper." "Cold pheasant is a good thing," said Syme reflectively, "and Burgundy is a spanking good thing. But really I do not want either of them so much as I want to know what the devil all this means, and what sort of costume you have got laid out for me. Where is it?" The servant lifted off a kind of ottoman, a long peacock blue drapery, rather of the nature of a domino, on the front of which was emblazoned a large golden sun, and which was splashed here and there with flaming stars and crescents. "You're to be dressed as Thursday, sir," said the valet somewhat affably. "Dressed as Thursday," said Syme in meditation. "It doesn't sound a warm costume." "Oh yes, sir," said the other eagerly. "The Thursday costume is quite warm, sir. It fastens up to the chin." "Well, I don't understand anything," said Syme, sighing. "I have been used so long to uncomfortable adventures that comfortable adventures knock me out. Still, I may be allowed to ask why I should be particularly like Thursday in a green frock spotted all over with the sun and the moon. Those orbs, I think, shine on other days. I once saw the moon on Tuesday, I remember." "Beg pardon, sir," said the valet. "Bible also provided for you." And with a respectful and rigid finger he pointed out a passage in the 1st chapter of Genesis. Syme read it, wondering. It was that in which the 4th day of the week is associated with the creation of the sun and moon. Here, however, they reckoned from a Christian Sunday. "This is getting wilder and wilder," said Syme, as he sat down in a chair. "Who are these people who provide cold pheasant and Burgundy and green clothes and Bibles? Do they provide everything?" "Yes, sir, everything," said the attendant gravely. "Shall I help you on with your costume?" "Oh, hitch the bally thing on," said Syme impatiently. But though he affected to despise the mummery, he felt a curious freedom and naturalness in his movements as the blue and gold garment fell about him, and when he found that he had to wear a sword, it stirred a boyish dream. As he passed out of the room, he flung the folds across his shoulder with a gesture. His sword stood out at an angle, and he had all the swagger of a troubadour. For these disguises did not disguise, but reveal. End of chapter 14.